Good afternoon and welcome back from our short lunch break. As we continue in dockets 2023-388E and 2023-403E, we are, let's take a roll call of commissioners. With us virtually, we have Commissioner Caston, present in the hearing room. We have Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Carolee Williams, and Chair Belser. And we are on ORS's case. Mr. Austin.
Thank you, Chair Belzer. For the court reporter, Joshua Austin, on behalf of ORS. We would next call Mr. Robert Lawyer and Ms. Elizabeth Pardue.
Go ahead, Ms. Sally.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear affirm the testimony you're about to give to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Okay, Ms. Pardue, I'll start with you. Ms. Pardue, could you please state your name for the record?
Certainly, Elizabeth A. Pardue,
By whom are you employed and in what capacity?
the South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff as an economist.
Did you prepare or cause to be prepared direct testimony consisting of 80 pages, that's 80, pre-filed in this proceeding on April 8th, 2024?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your direct testimony?
I do not.
If I ask you the same questions today as those posed in your direct testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Madam Chair, ORS would move the direct testimony of Ms. Pardue into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Ms. Pardue's pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record as if given from the stand.
Ms. Pardue, did you also prepare or cause to be prepared 6 exhibits marked as EAP 1 through EAP 6 that accompanied your direct testimony?
Yes,
Do you have any changes or corrections to those 6 exhibits?
I do not.
Madam Chair, ORS would move exhibits EAP 1 through EAP 6 into the record as the next composite hearing exhibit.
Ms. Pardue's exhibits which accompanied her pre-filed direct testimony and marked EAP 1 through EAP 6 will be a composite exhibit marked for identification as hearing exhibit 50 and admitted into the evidence of the case.
Thank you. Ms. Pardue, did you prepare or cause to be prepared 30 pages of sir rebuttal testimony pre-filed in this proceeding on April 29th, 2024?
I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to that testimony?
I do not.
If I ask you the same questions today as posed in your pre-filed sir rebuttal testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Madam Chair, ORS would move the sir rebuttal testimony of Ms. Pardue into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Ms. Pardue's pre-filed sir rebuttal testimony will be entered into the record as if given from the stand.
And Ms. Pardue, did you also prepare or cause to be prepared 1 exhibit marked sir rebuttal exhibit EAP 1 that accompanied your sir rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to that?
No, I do not.
Madam Chair, ORS would move sir rebuttal exhibit EAP-1 into the record as the next hearing exhibit.
Ms. Pardue's sir rebuttal exhibit EAP 1 will be marked for identification as hearing exhibit 51 and admitted into the evidence of the case.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, before she gives her summary, ORS would also designate Ms. Pardue as an expert witness in the field of cost of capital and capital structure.
Any objection or any voir dire of the witness regarding her qualifications as an expert in
Cost of capital and capital structure.
cost of capital and capital structure? Hearing none, we will recognize Ms. Pardue as an expert in those areas.
Thank you. Ms. Pardue, did you prepare a summary of your testimony?
Yes, I did.
Would you please give that at this time?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and members of the Commission. I pre-filed both direct and sir rebuttal testimony in the current rate adjustment proceeding of Duke Energy Carolinas, LLC, which I will refer to as DEC or the company. In my direct testimony, I recommended the approval of a 9.84% ROE within a range of 9.73% to 9.94%, and a capital structure consisting of 50.03% equity and 49.97% debt. My direct testimony also responded to the direct testimony of company witnesses Chris Bauer and James Coyne. In sir rebuttal testimony, I reaffirmed ORS's recommendations in this proceeding and responded to the rebuttal testimony of company witnesses Bauer and Coyne. Subsequent to the filing of my direct and sir rebuttal testimony in this matter, the following parties reached an agreement resolving positions in the docket. The company, ORS, South Carolina Energy Users Committee, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, Coastal Conservation League, Vote Solar, and the South Carolina Small Business Chamber of Commerce. Where appropriate, I will refer to these parties collectively as the settling parties. I have reviewed the settlement with particular emphasis on the cost of capital components, including the return on equity, capital structure, and cost of debt, and represent to the Commission that the agreement reflects a compromise between all settling parties, results in just and reasonable rates, and is in the public interest. Specifically, the settling parties reached an agreement on a return on equity of 9.94% and a capital structure consisting of 51.21% equity and 48.79% debt. I would note that the agreed upon ROE of 9.94% is within my recommended range. In addition, the agreed upon capital structure reflects the company's actual capital structure as of February 29th, 2024. Therefore, these terms of the settlement agreement are reasonable, and ORS requests the Commission accept the settlement in its entirety. This concludes my summary.
Thank you, Ms. Pardue. And now, Mr. Lawyer, I'll pivot to you. Good afternoon, Mr. Lawyer. Could you please state your name for the record?
Robert A. Lawyer.
By whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm employed by the state of South Carolina as Director of Energy with the Office of Regulatory Staff.
Did you prepare or cause to be prepared settlement testimony consisting of 5 pages pre-filed in this proceeding on May 17th, 2024?
Yes,
Do you have any changes or corrections to your settlement testimony?
I do not.
If I were to ask you the same questions today as posed in your settlement testimony, would your answers be the same?
They would, yes.
Madam Chair, ORS would move the settlement testimony of Mr. Lawyer into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Lawyer's pre-filed settlement testimony will be entered into the record as if given from the stand.
Thank you. Mr. Lawyer, did you also prepare a summary?
I did.
Would you please provide that at this time?
Yes. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Vice Chair, members of the Commission. I have the honor of appearing in person before you today to present the settlement agreement that ORS believes is the result of earnest, good faith, and complex negotiations between many stakeholders with diverse interests. ORS fully supports the settlement agreement and requests the Commission approve it as written. It is clear from the settlement agreement that each of the settling parties made compromises from their original positions to achieve a balanced resolution of all issues in the general rate proceeding, and also to demonstrate the collective support for recovery of reasonable and prudent company investments in order to provide reliable and high-quality electric service for its South Carolina customers. ORS believes the settlement agreement is in the public interest for the following reasons. Number one, the overall reduction in the revenue requirement increase and the EDIT rider significantly mitigate the impact of the company's rate application to DEC customers as they continue to face economic hardship. For example, the typical monthly residential bill for a DEC customer using 1,000 kilowatt hours would increase by approximately $18.95 or 13.6%, exclusive of the EDIT rider. With the EDIT rider, the typical monthly residential bill would reflect a net increase of $12.53, or 9% for the duration of the EDIT rider reduction, which is projected to end on July 31st of 2026. Overall, the settlement agreement reduces the retail revenue increase from 15.5% to 11.5%, or $156 million per year through July 2026. While any increase to expenses is difficult for customers, the settlement agreement works to minimize the increase while enabling ongoing company investments to provide reliable and high-quality electric service. The settlement agreement contains several other provisions that provide benefits to customers that may not have been achieved absent the compromises of the settling parties. For example, the company agreed to a one-time disallowance of $17.2 million in coal ash basin closure costs incurred through December 31st of 2023. The parties compromised on a reduced ROE of 9.94% and agreed to a capital structure for rate-making purposes. The company agreed to a one-time additional adjustment of $3 million for future sublease and parking revenue associated with the Duke Energy Plaza Company agreed to limit the amount of rate case expenses to be recovered from customers. Settlement agreement also contains provisions that would require the company to provide more regular, fulsome reports to the Commission and ORS regarding its activities with storm and vegetation management. The increased level of reporting by the company will provide enhanced transparency and oversight of critical storm restoration and vegetation management activities undertaken by the company. Further, the settlement agreement provides customer protections to terminate the grid improvement plan deferral and limits carrying costs during the deferral periods to the cost of debt for all deferrals. Finally, settlement agreement saves the time and cost of a fully litigated hearing before the Commission and any ensuing appeals. ORS fully supports the settlement agreement and respectfully requests this Commission approve it as presented. This concludes my summary.
Thank you, Mr. Lawyer. Chair Belzer, this panel is available for cross-examination and commissioner questions.
Thank you, Mr. Austin. Department of Consumer Affairs.
Good afternoon, Mr. Lawyer. I'm going to start with you. Actually a couple questions from your summary that I didn't have on normal list. You mentioned the $17 million in a coal ash disallowance. Does that sound right?
Yes, sir. 17.2 million.
Okay. Did you say that wouldn't have been possible without the settlement? I thought I may have misinterpreted what you said.
It was a part of the settlement. I could only speculate if that would have occurred.
Okay.
Minus the settlement.
Okay, I may have misheard you. Do you recall, was that part of the recommendation of Mr. Whitliff?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And then we heard about, were you in the room earlier when counsel for Duke was talking with Mr. Coyne about the levers in the settlement and customer savings?
I was in the room. I don't know if I remember that exact.
And they mentioned the EDIT mitigation. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Do you recall also, was the EDIT mitigation proposed in Duke's application?
It was.
Okay, thank you. In your settlement testimony, you stated that the ROE and capital structure results in savings to customers of approximately $41 million. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm going to show you. Did you see me discuss with either Ms. Jiggets or Ms. Perry, or particularly Ms. Jiggets, around that number?
Yes.
Okay, and she wasn't sure. She wasn't familiar with that number. Do you recall that?
I do recall that, yes.
I showed her this, and I just want to see if it reflects essentially how you came up with the number. We won't harp on this too long. And just to kind of walk, again, try to be quick with it. Let's see, how do I have this set up here? At the bottom, we have what the company proposed with a 10.5% ROE, 4.56 debt, 53.47 cap structure. And then at the top, we have the settlement terms. We have essentially comes out to two different rate of returns. Multiply that times the rate base in the settlement. And here, my math is coming out to $41.8 million. Does that look like roughly how you determined that $41 million number?
To be honest with you, Mr. Hall, I did not determine that number.
Okay. Okay.
The audit department at ORS provided that number to
Okay.
me. I confirmed it with the exhibit that Chair Belsler also showed that same day. Looks like this one is the attachment A, Jigget's Exhibit 1.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we went through that as well. Okay. Just wanted to confirm, but that is ORS's number, and
Yes.
it's been confirmed. Okay, great. All right, that's actually all the questions I have for you. Thank you. Ms. Pardue, how are you doing?
I'm good, Mr. Hall. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. So generally, DEC's authorized ROE in this proceeding should be market-based. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay. And would you agree that Mr. Coyne uses cost of equity models that are not market-based?
I believe as I reflect in my direct testimony, I do have concerns with his use of the bond yield plus risk premium model and the expected earnings model.
Ms. Pardue, you have a soft voice, so I know you want to look at who's asking the question, but I need you to look at the microphone if you can. Thank you.
And just to confirm, you said his risk premium approach, was that right?
As I discussed in my direct testimony, I do have concerns with the bond yield plus risk premium approach and the expected earnings approach.
Thank you. And you recommended in your testimony that the commission reject those approaches, is that right?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. And forgive me, sometimes these ROE terms kind of run together, and the other one was the expected earnings approach?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And page 14, lines 14 to 16 of your direct testimony.
You said page 14, correct?
Yes,
I am.
lines 14 to 16.
Thank you.
You state that analysts often employ multiple models to estimate equity cost rates, correct?
Correct.
And I think it's been brought up already in this hearing, but you used the DCF and CAPM in your as your methodologies because they are, quote, widely accepted. Does that sound right?
Correct.
And on page 14, also lines 18 to 22, you state, conducting cost of equity analysis is not a precise exercise and requires the application of sensible judgment grounded in objective, measurable data and mathematically sound methods to estimate such costs properly. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And do you believe your DCF and CAPM are both mathematically sound?
I do believe the way that I have structured them, yes, they are mathematically sound.
And do analysts have to make choices regarding how they implement cost of equity models?
Certainly. So cost of equity analysis is intended to estimate the investor expectation in the context of current market conditions. As a cost of equity analyst and as other cost of equity analysts do, we must make good, prudent decisions into the inputs that we use in our models. They must be rational. They must be well-reasoned.
And would one example of those choices be what growth rate to use in a DCF?
Yes, that is one of the inputs.
And another might be what equity risk premium to use in the CAPM?
Correct.
So what objective measurable data did you rely on to determine that your cost of equity models are the most appropriate?
Certainly. So for the DCF model, there are three key inputs. The dividend yield, which is made up of the stock price and dividends for each company in the proxy group, and then the growth rate variable. For the CAPM, there are also three inputs, one being the risk-free rate, one being the beta, and the third being the ERP. For each of those, I have cited two widely available and well-respected sources. Several of the data points came from Value Line. Some of my ERP estimates or all of my ERP estimates came from either Dr. DeMotorin, Kroll, or the IESE Business School. And as for the risk-free rates, I used 30-year Treasury yields from the U.S. Treasury. And the final input that would not have just been from Value Line would be the growth rates in my DCF. Those also include projections from Yahoo Finance and Zacks.
Okay. Is it fair to say that not all analysts would agree with how you implemented your cost of equity models, correct?
I think even just in the testimony presented before the commission in this proceeding, we have all three approached this differently.
I'd agree. I'm looking at page 66 of your direct testimony, lines 9 to 10.
I'm there.
Okay, and there you state that Witness Coin's 10.5% ROE for DEC is excessive and should be rejected by the commission, correct?
Correct.
And One of the cost of equity models that he uses to determine that excessive 10.5% ROE is the DCF model, correct?
Correct. That is one of his 4 models.
And did his DCF range between 8.36 and 11.14?
I don't have those numbers in front of me, but that sounds approximately right, subject to check.
Yeah, let's make sure. I think I've got it as page 67 in your testimony, lines 5 to 7.
Yes, that is correct. 8.36% to 11.14%.
And Mr. Coyne's DCF is problematic, right?
When you say problematic, I do feel that some of the inputs and the way that he's approached his DCF does lead to some higher results than, for example, the results that I received in my analysis using a DCF model.
And I just want to find what exactly you said about that, just to make sure we're on the same page. I'm looking at page 68. Let's see, lines 5 to 7. Make sure I've got that right. And let's see. No, I'm sorry. Yes. Page 68, lines 3 to 5. You state, witness Coyne's DCF approach of selecting the lowest and highest growth rates in addition to the average growth rates for each company is problematic and has led to an overstatement of an appropriate ROE for DEC in this proceeding. Does that summarize what you were just saying?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And one of the growth rates Mr. Coyne used in his DCF is 9.50%. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Is a 9.5% growth rate reasonable to use in a constant growth DCF?
When used in isolation, that would lead to higher results, which is one of the reasons that I mentioned my concern with his use of the maximum growth rate for one of the iterations of his DCF model. When used in conjunction, however, with the other 14 companies in the proxy group, we do tend to see a bit of a mellowing as we average out, which is why I also use both averages and medians in my own analysis.
And I think you say that, and maybe a little bit more, but on page 47, lines 11 to 13 of your direct testimony, I can see if I've got that. You state, it is also important to remember one of the assumptions of DCF analysis is the growth rate will continue in perpetuity, making it especially important not to overestimate. Does that sound right?
That is part of my testimony, yes.
And do you agree that a 9.5% growth rate is sustainable in perpetuity?
Again, I would have to go back to, in isolation, that would be a quite high growth rate. However, in the context of averaging that one growth rate with the other companies in the proxy group, that number is mellowed quite substantially.
And now I'm looking at page 47 of your testimony, lines 19 to 22. You state that the projected U.S. GDP growth rate, i.e. the measure of output often used to indicate the long-term sustainable growth rate of the domestic economy, should be considered a limiting factor in sustainable growth for a utility over time. Does that sound right?
Yes, that is my testimony.
Okay. What is the projected GDP growth rate?
As I stated in my testimony, the CBO, which is the Congressional Budget Office, is projecting around a 3.8% GDP rate.
Okay. And I believe in your testimony you also said that, quote, would reach nearly 4% year over year in the next decade. Does that sound right?
That's the 3.8 rounded to
Yeah.
roughly 4%.
Okay. So if the 3.8 or 4% is a limiting factor in sustainable growth, then Mr. Coyne's growth of 9.5% would produce an excessive cost of equity result, right?
Not necessarily. If you continue reading on the bottom of page 47 and top of page 48 of my direct testimony, I also discuss how it would be unreasonable to assume that investors would never expect growth above the growth in the U.S. economy. I think probably for most of us in this room, we would probably, if we had a rough idea, we would probably expect growth in our stock portfolios above 4% at some time. This is an exercise in this piece of my analysis. This is an exercise to keep in mind so that we don't have, for example, an overall average growth rate. Let's just say roughly for the sake of argument, 3 or 4 times higher than the projected yield in the economy.
Sure, and let me, since you mentioned it, well, I'd like to put it up here real quick. I'm looking at the top of page 48 in your testimony. And actually, let me just give a little bit of context. Go to the bottom of 47 first, and the benefit of the commission. Get that on the screen. So here you're talking about, you say, in other words, U.S. GDP growth should be considered a limiting factor, right? We covered that. And then nonetheless, it is not uncommon for rate of return analysts to incorporate growth factors that exceed projected long-term GDP growth in the DCF, as the intent of the DCF is to capture investor expectations of dividend growth in the long term. That's kind of what you were saying, right?
Correct.
Okay. And then you stated, like you just said, that it would be unreasonable to assume investors never expect returns beyond anticipated growth in the overall market. I believe you just stated that, correct?
Correct.
And then you said, however, it is prudent to use this finance principle as a check to ensure estimated growth rates are not excessive. Is that correct?
Yes.
And by finance principle, are you referring to what was at the beginning of that paragraph, the projected U.S. GDP growth rate being a limiting factor? Is that the finance principle you're referring to there?
So that's a piece of it. There are certain assumptions that go into each of the cost of equity models, such as the DCF, for example. We are assuming in the constant growth DCF that the growth rate will continue on in perpetuity. Mm-hmm. So that is the finance principle that I'm alluding to effectively.
Okay. So would it be reasonable to use a growth rate in a DCF that is equal to the projected GDP growth rate?
Based on the analysis that I conducted in setting up my models and achieving the ultimate results of my models in this case, I do believe a growth rate around 4% in total for a DCF analysis for DEC at this time would be a bit low. I believe my average was a little above 5%.
And do you believe it's low because, as you said, it would be unreasonable to assume investors never expect returns beyond anticipated growth in the overall economy?
I think that's part of it. When we are modeling and estimating the cost of equity, we're trying to estimate for all investors. You know, there are certainly many different investors who have higher risk tolerance, some who have lower, and we are trying to incorporate all of those. That's also why I use a variety of different growth measures in my DCF so that I feel I'm getting the most well-rounded picture of what would be representative for investors.
And so that, because some investors might expect returns below anticipated growth in the overall economy, right?
That is certainly possible, but we can't expect that all investors would expect growth below.
Okay. Would you say your average is? Well, I'll just ask it. I think I know your answer. But did you do anything to determine what investors' expected growth is now?
When you say what investors expect growth is now, do you mean at this current moment?
When you conducted your analysis?
I used data through March 15th. That was the data cutoff for my analysis at this time. That gives me time to double check my numbers, and my numbers also filter through other witnesses at ORS. So I can't wait until the last minute to finalize. At that time, I do feel that my estimates reflect investor expectations.
And do you know what your DCF result would have been if you used a growth rate equal to the projected GDP growth rate?
I did not do that calculation.
Okay. Are you aware that Mr. Rothschild in his rebuttal testimony stated that had you used a 4% growth rate, then your DCF cost of equity would have been 8.53 to 8.61?
I do seem to recall that. I don't have it in front of me, but I think that sounds about right.
Okay. I just want to show you. This is your exhibit EAP4. Oh, sorry, I'll show you this one first. And so this is, correct me if I'm wrong, essentially how you've determined the DCF results. Does that sound about right?
That is correct.
And so when we're talking about growth rate, we're talking about these two columns, is that right?
Correct. Column 2 is reflecting the average growth rates that would be summarized on page EAP or Exhibit EAP 4, page 5. And column 5 would be exhibiting the median growth rates.
Okay. And so, subject to check, would you agree that Mr. Rothschild, to come up with those numbers, would essentially have substituted 3.8% here and 4% in column, 3.8% in column 2 and 4% in column 5?
I suppose that could be the case. I don't know how he did his calculation specifically.
But that's the growth rate input in the DCF, right?
Correct. If he were going to plug in growth rates for each of those companies in columns 2 and 5, those would be the numbers he would be changing.
And then you add whatever in column 2 to what's in column 3, correct? To get what's in column 4?
Correct. So column 3 is the adjusted yield, which will be the dividend yield in column 1, adjusted by 1 plus 1/2 the growth rate in column 2 in this instance.
And then do the same for columns 5 through 7.
Correct.
You would add them up and you have your mean and median down here at the bottom, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. Do you know what growth rate Mr. Rothschild used in his DCF models?
I know that I read his testimony. His exact number is not coming to mind.
Okay, so subject to check, would you agree with me that he uses a growth rate of 3.88 to 3.9 in his sustainable growth method and 3.93 to 4.29 in his option implied growth DCF?
I'll accept that subject to check.
Okay. And those growth rates you would agree are in line with the projected GDP growth rates we quoted earlier as your limiting factors, correct?
They are closely associated to the 3.8% GDP projection from CBO, yes.
Yeah, which you refer to as a limiting factor, is that right?
In my testimony, yes.
Okay. Ms. Pardue, your CAP-M results range from 8.39 to 9.97, is that right?
That is correct.
And I think it's been mentioned already, but your ROE recommendation does not factor in the results of your CAP-M at all, is that correct?
That is correct.
And I think on page 57, you say you give preference to the results of your DCF since the DCF better reflects current market conditions, correct?
That is correct.
On page 14, lines 18 to 22 of your direct, you state, conducting a cost of equity analysis is not a precise exercise. Sound right? I think I actually read part of that quote earlier. So I just want to make sure you
Sure.
agree.
Could you remind me of the line numbers one more time, please?
Well, actually, we did that one already. How about page 19 of your direct? You answer the question, can a precise cost of capital be determined? Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
Okay. And again, your DCF ranges from 9.73 to 9.94, right?
Correct.
Would you agree that 21 basis points wide seems fairly precise?
I would only state that I conduct a very objective analysis of the cost of equity using both the DCF and CAP-M models, and the results of my models are what they are. I use very well-reasoned methods. They're methods that I have used in the past with no changes, and I am inputting the inputs and allowing the data to speak for themselves, certainly not driving to a certain result. So as it happened in this case, yes, my DCF range was 21 basis points roughly, while my CAP-M range was much larger.
So you're saying you're putting in the inputs and letting them speak for themselves, but then you completely disregarded one of your models, right?
In the context of current market conditions, I do not feel that the CAP-M is reflective of cost of equity for a utility such as Duke Energy Carolinas at this time.
Okay. And the lower bounds of your DCF was 9.73?
That is correct.
Would a 9.71 be reflective of current market conditions?
Since it's not a precise exercise, the range that I received, if you will, as a result of my DCF analysis indicated 9.73% to 9.94% with a 9.84% midpoint. As we all know, as we sit here, the settling parties have also come to an agreement at the 9.94% ROE that is the top of my range. As to whether a couple basis points below the low end of my range, based on my analysis, I have derived the range that I have. But again, it's not a precise exercise, so, you know, should this or any other commission find that a slightly different number may be reasonable, that would be their choice.
And the midpoint of your CAP-M is 9.18, correct?
That is correct.
So would you agree that if you gave equal weight to your CAP-M and your DCF, your midpoint would have been 9.51?
I did not do that calculation.
But it would just be adding the midpoint of 9.18 plus 9.84, the midpoint of your DCF, subject to check is 19.02, divided by 2 is 9.51?
I will accept that subject to check. I just did not do that independent calculation.
Yeah. And DEC's current authorized ROE is 9.50, correct?
Correct, it is.
And have you heard the testimony in this hearing so far that they have been able to raise money to pay for all the coal remediation and grid improvement plans with the 9.50 ROE?
Could you repeat the question?
Have you heard the testimony in this case that they have been able to raise the money for the coal remediation and grid improvement plan programs with their current 9.50 ROE?
So I know the company has obviously requested an ROE increase in this case and requested certain extensions of deferrals. I have been listening to the testimony. I'm just not sure if I'm keying in on what you're saying.
They've spent a lot of money so far, right, for these various programs?
I do not analyze those programs specifically. I do believe that they are in the several $1 million range.
And you say several $1 million range?
For
the coal ash remediation and grid improvement plan?
it's not my testimony, so I would have to defer that.
Okay, I'll accept that. What betas did you use in your CAP-M analysis?
I use the betas published by Value Line.
Okay. Do other publications provide betas for companies in the proxy group?
Other publications, for example, I know Mr. Coyne uses Bloomberg as well as Value Line.
Okay, and their Yahoo Finance is another one?
I believe they do.
Why did you choose to use 5-year historical betas published by Value Line?
I just use the Value Line betas not because they're based on a 5-year average. Value Line is a well-respected publication and conducts analyses that investors presumably use in their in determining where they're going to invest their money. And so I use Value Line for a number of different inputs in my models and to evaluate data that I use in the context of my testimony.
Okay. And would you agree that the 5-year historical betas are influenced by the market turmoil during the COVID-19 pandemic?
So for the last 5 years, considering we are in 2024 currently, yes, the numbers going into the betas could include data as far back as 2019.
Okay. Did you investigate any other published betas that might better represent current market conditions than Value Line?
No, Value Line was the source that I used.
So do you think that one of the reasons your CAP-M does not reflect current market conditions as much as the DCF is because it relies on 5-year historical betas?
No, I don't think that's the case. If you look at the betas that I use and the betas that Mr. Coyne uses, for example, I believe we're in the same ballpark. The CAP-M model has the 3 inputs that I mentioned earlier, the risk-free rate, the ERP, and the beta. And 2 of those are estimated. The beta is not something that can be directly measured, nor can the equity risk premium. So because both of those are being estimated, we have a wide range. We look at ERPs, for example. We can have a wide range of numbers. In my analysis, the highest ERP, for example, that I found for this case in my analysis was a 5.7%. We're also including the risk-free rate in the CAPM analysis. That's really the only data point that we are able to measure in the current market without making an estimated analysis.
Do you know if beta is calculated based on a shorter time period that weren't impacted by COVID-19 and the market turmoil might better reflect current market conditions?
Do I know whether they would? Was that your question?
Yeah, if there were betas that weren't all 5 years, that were shorter than 5 years, would that better reflect current market conditions?
So part of the concern I think we run into when we are using a shorter time frame is that we can be influenced by ebbs and flows in the market, for example, to adhere, for example, to the efficient market hypothesis. We would use technically the single stock price on the day that we're conducting our analysis. I use a blended over a 30-day average to help smooth that out. In the context of betas, I have no concern with using the 5-year average. I think that it is still reflective of the current market.
So you believe the 5-year historical betas are still reflective of the current market? Is that?
I think they're appropriate to use in the context of current market conditions, yes.
So given that you did not think the CAPM reflects current market conditions, did you consider changing any inputs to possibly better reflect current market conditions?
In the CAPM specifically?
Yes.
So again, I let the data speak for themselves. I know how to structure the basic mathematical CAPM equation, and I know based on my research and my experience what inputs are reflective, what I feel are reflective of current market conditions to model investor expectations. As I am gathering those data points, I am considering the validity of each of those. Had I felt that something was incorrect, I would not have used it. Once I run the models, though, other than checking for formulas that may be computing incorrectly, making sure there wasn't a data entry error, I'm not trying to change the models to achieve a certain result.
Okay. Do you think betas calculated based on investors' current expectations would better reflect current market conditions?
By that, I presume we're talking about a shorter time frame.
Just in general, if betas reflected, current investors' current expectations.
The betas published by Value Line are the most up-to-date betas for each of the companies in the proxy. And I do believe, as you can see, comparing my numbers to those in Mr. Coyne's testimony, they also accord fairly closely to those published by Bloomberg as well.
Okay. Do you have any disagreements with Mr. Coyne about how he implemented his CAPM?
I do have concerns with his ERP estimates. I do feel that they're quite high. Again, in my analysis, the highest ERP that I found was a 5.7%, and I know that Mr. Coyne's ERPs did trail above that. I also make note in my testimony that he does use both the current and projected 30-year Treasury yield as a risk-free rate. And although we're in a situation right now where the projections are actually a little lower than the actual numbers, I discuss why, generally speaking, that is problematic.
And so from what you're saying about his equity risk premium component, you believe that his equity risk premium component is overstated, is that correct?
Yes, based on my research.
Okay. And your 8.39% CAPM result is based on, I think, Dr. Damodaran's equity risk premium of 4.33%, correct?
Let me double check that is the input that resulted in the 8.33.
While you're doing
I
that, will you
believe
tell me
that's
how you pronounce Dr. Damodaran? Because I think we say it differently.
All I know is I say Damodaran, but I can't say that I'm
Okay.
saying that exactly correct. So you were asking for the 8.39. Yes, so that was the result of Dr. Damodaran's ERP estimate for, I believe it was the one published on March 1, 2024, and a risk-free rate that accords with the average, 30-day average of the 30-year Treasury yield.
And his published ERPs are well-known and commonly referenced, correct?
I believe so, yes.
Would you say they're in line with the finance principle we talked about earlier with about GDP growth rate being a limiting factor?
Would I say that his ERPs are in line?
Yes.
Be- Just to make sure I'm understanding, are you drawing the comparison between the two numbers or derivation?
Yeah, so his 4.33% equity risk premium is close in line to the GDP growth rates, correct?
His 4.33% is reflected in my Exhibit EAP5 is numerically close to the GDP, yes, but those are two different figures.
Yeah, thank you. Would it be reasonable for a rate of return witness to use a 4.33% equity risk premium in a CAPM analysis?
I think it is appropriate, and I used it myself for that reason.
Did you see Mr. Mehta's cross-examination of Mr. Rothschild or my questions to Mr. Coyne regarding the governor's executive order, the census data, Act 220? Did you see or hear any of that?
I did, yes.
Okay. Did you consider any of those documents in your ROE analysis?
No, I did not. I don't believe any of the cost of capital witnesses here did.
Okay, thank you. I believe that's all the questions I have. Just double check. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Ms. Pardue, in your summary, you referenced, I believe, the capital structure and the settlement agreement and a date.
Correct.
Could you state that again? I didn't catch the date.
Sure. It accords to the actual capital structure for the company as of February 29th, 2024. That was referenced in Mr. Bauer's rebuttal testimony.
Okay, thank you. Commissioners. Commissioner Carolyn Williams.
Thank you very much, Chair Belzer. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I think I have questions for each of you, and I can define, I know which one I want for each, which is sometimes the best I can, that's putting me a little ahead of the game sometimes. For me, Ms. Pardue, earlier, so on Thursday, I think there was some discussion about Ms. Jiggett's exhibits that are part of the settlement. Are you a part of the team that was reviewing them, and is there any, are you able to say that they look right, are appropriate?
So I was not part of that analysis and the ultimate derivation of that. I would have to punt to our audit witness, Mr. Brazino.
Okay, thank you. Great. And were you present for the rebuttal testimony of witness Coyne?
I was, yes.
Do you agree with his statement that the settlement ROE is below the market rate cost of equity for DEC?
So based on my analysis, it is toward the upper end of what, again, my analysis indicated as a reasonable range. Again, it is the top of my range specifically. If you include the results of my CAPM, it's about 3 basis points below.
And does the settlement ROE of 9.94 yield a favorable compromise between customers and the utility?
Absolutely.
And witness lawyer. In your settlement testimony, there's something that you aren't going to need it. There's something that you said in your preliminary that I am struggling to remember, but
Commissioner, could I ask you to speak more into your mic, please?
absolutely.
Thank you.
What I'm wondering, I know, it's related to the EDIT and the impact of the EDIT rolling off. And what I wondered is if you could speak to the impact of settlement number 45 and 46 and the role that they may play. And they are the $1 million in shareholder dollars that are going for health and safety funding, to participate in agencies' weatherization activities and the company's weatherization program. And then the second is the low-income affordability study. And clearly I'm asking from the perspective of when the EDIT rolls off, it's got an impact, and it's helping now, but then there's going to be a bump in what everybody's paying. Is there any synchronicity between the timing of these two elements in the settlement agreement that have the ability to someday impact those customers that are going to be most impacted by
Okay, I think I understand the
the
question.
increase and then the additional increase that comes when the edict rolls off?
First of all, these are exclusive of the EDIT. They do not have anything to do with each other. But once it comes off, I think your question is, will these help
Yes.
the customers? That is the intention and the hope. We're very hopeful that that would happen. Whenever you can get more granular information on a certain population or segment of the population, and you can target certain programs directly to them, I think would be beneficial. It at least has the potential to be. We'll see what happens when these do transpire.
And I know I used a lot of words to ask that question, but I really was focused on the timing, because what I'm thinking about is in 2026, when rates go up again, will there have been, is it time so that there can be some significant impact as a result of those two parts of this settlement agreement?
I can't make a definitive determination of that.
Okay.
I can only, again, be hopeful that it would coincide, or at least be close. And in the meantime, I hope there's some other mitigating factors that might come along. For instance, maybe the fuel case later this year. I know they went up extremely, a good bit last time, and we're hopeful that will help some too. I don't know what that impact would be, but do expect it to come down.
Right. And I understand that about the fuel case. And so you're saying that you're hopeful that this timing in 2026 can make some difference to the targeted groups?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Thank you. No further questions.
Commissioner Caston, did I hear you with a question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Chair. And good afternoon, Mr. Lauder and Ms. Pardue. Can you hear me okay?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Yes, I can.
Yes.
Good. And Ms. Pardue, Mr. Hall touched on some of the things I was going to ask. So if it sounds like I'm asking it again, I apologize, because I kind of want to go through the thoughts that I had, if it's okay. And I was on page 56 of your direct testimony, line 15 to page 57, line 1 through 2. You don't have to look it up, but if you want, you can. Where you're referencing your use of the DCF and capital asset pricing model, the CAPM. You state that I believe the use of these models to evaluate an appropriate cost of equity for the company adheres to the standards set forth in Hope and Bluefield. Is this correct?
Correct.
And on page 8, line 19 to page 9, line 1 of your direct, you state, given the current economic and capital market conditions, I do not directly incorporate the results of my CAPM analysis in my recommendation. And I know you and Mr. Hall were talking about this, but is your decision to not incorporate the results of your CAPM analysis in your recommendation indicative of a flaw in the model, or does it cast doubt on the credibility of the model?
I don't know, Mr. Caston, that I would go to quite that level with it. In the context of current market conditions, what we can see from the results of my DCF model, for example, what we can see when we evaluate other ROEs that have been authorized for electric utilities, either generally or vertically integrated utilities specifically, we're able to kind of gauge what current market conditions are pointing to. I feel that the CAPM model has certainly been well recognized among utility commissions, just as it turns out in this instance with the results that come from the well-reasoned inputs that I used. The number just does seem, the range specifically is quite broad, and the midpoint does seem to be quite low.
But you do agree that Mr. Rothschild and Mr. Coyne both used CAPM, whether you agree with their results or not, correct?
Correct. All three of us use both the DCF and CAPM. You can see the difference in our results based on the inputs and assumptions that we use within those models.
So you probably already answered this, but when I was reading through that part of your testimony where you said you did not directly incorporate the results, did you account for any of the results of your CAPM analysis in your recommendation anywhere, or when you say I did not directly incorporate, does that mean didn't even consider it or use any of it?
Sure. So the results of both of my different models, I did consider them when it came to making the ultimate recommendation. I did base my recommendation on the range of my DCF model, which was the 9.73% to 9.94%. And I will note that that range is within the range of results from the CAPM. The CAPM model just happened to pull in some much lower numbers as well.
And I think you've probably already answered this, but it just wasn't clear to me, and I went back to direct testimony where, you talked about current economic and capital market conditions. I guess more specific to what current economic and capital market conditions are you referring to that caused you not to want to include the results in your CAPM?
Certainly. So as I believe I may have discussed earlier, 2 of the 3 inputs in the DCF model are very factual. They're directly measurable, and those are the stock price and the dividend. Both of those together create the dividend yield component of the DCF model, whereas when we look at the CAPM, 2 of the 3 inputs have to be estimated, and those are the beta and the ERP. In the context of current market conditions, we are in a bit of a rising interest rate environment. The Fed will meet again. I believe it's June 11th and 12th. We'll see what they may or may not do as far as changes to the federal funds rate. Inflation has come down quite a bit, and I will note inflation is not a direct input, but it is a fact of the economy at this current time. Inflation has come down quite a bit since its high in, I believe, June of 2022. But the CPI is still in the low to mid 3% range. So we are still in a bit of an elevated interest rate environment. Given all those factors, given the other trends that we're able to see for ROEs that have been authorized, including my CAPM, especially with an equal weight, for example, I don't think that would have been appropriate at this time.
And I know Mr. Hall, I guess, went through the range if the CAPM, if you included your CAPM, what the range would be on the low to the high. You recall that?
I believe so, yes.
I think you said that was 8.39 to 9.97 if the CAPM were included. Within that range, say that 8.39, 9.97, if CAPM were included, do you believe that somewhere within that range would be an appropriate or more appropriate ROE?
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, I do feel that the DCF range, as indicated in my testimony of 9.73 to 9.94, is reasonable, and the CAPM does include that. So that does give me, in some ways, even more comfort with the recommended range. I will also note the settled ROE falls within both of those ranges as well. To try to select, if we look at the results of my CAPM analysis in isolation, to try to select a certain slice of it as potentially more reasonable, I would hesitate to do that. I don't like to discount reasonably reasoned inputs without good reason. I know I said reason a lot there. But I would be perhaps a little concerned to try to take a chunk of it, if you will.
If Mr. Cohen, Mr. Rothschild, or anyone else that were doing this here, if they ultimately only used a model instead of multiple models, they only used one model, results from one model, would that trouble you at all? Would that bother you?
I'm so sorry, Mr. Commissioner. Could you repeat the last part of that question?
Would that bother you? Would that be okay with you if others use just one model to develop an ROE or an ROE band?
Certainly. So I think part of the consideration there is it would depend on the model that's being used and the inputs that are being used. Cost of equity, as I believe we've established here, is not a precise exercise. And so there are different ways that one can go about estimating the cost of equity. There are different inputs, as you can certainly see just from looking at my analysis compared to Mr. Coyne's and Mr. Rothschild's. There are certainly different ways that analysts can look at it. It's kind of like baking a pie, if you will. There are multiple ways to bake a pie and multiple different pies that one could make. I believe it was Mr. Rothschild who said, it may have been on Friday, that he would rather have one good model than 1,000 bad ones, and I do certainly adhere to that. I did mention in my testimony my concerns with 2 of the models that Mr. Coyne used, for example. So when we take those out of the equation, we are all 3 effectively using the DCF and CAPM. To take that a step further, I do support not only the recommended ROE range that I put forward in my direct testimony as being reasonable, but also the settlement position as being reasonable as well.
I understand that, and I'm not trying to be combative. I mean, you've held to what you've said quite well. But I did read those various testimonies. I did read Mr. Coyne's, I did read Mr. Rothschild's and yours. And rightly or wrongly, because clearly, there's differences. And I think you had differences with Mr. Coyne, Mr. Rothschild, and the others with each other. But they were confident enough to use their models, both DCF and CAPM. And I guess what I'm personally struggling with, and I'm certainly not trying to be critical at all, and I'm not saying that the range of 8.39 to 9.97 is any more appropriate than anything else. But when I think about whatever that magic number is, whatever the more appropriate number is there a greater likelihood it might be somewhere in that 8.39 to 9.97? Or this narrow range, 0.2 narrow range, is so much more precise, right, and accurate? Is it possible that maybe the more appropriate ROE could fall outside of that 0.21? It may be maybe a little higher, maybe a little lower.
Certainly, Commissioner. So based on my analysis, I did find, and these are just the output that came from my running of these models, I did find that the 9.73% to 9.94% range to be reasonable in the context of current market conditions. I don't know if this would be helpful, but I could point to a table that I included as part of my surrebuttal testimony. Bear with me, I know it's in here. This would be on page 17 of my surrebuttal testimony, table 2. These are the average authorized ROEs for electric utilities across 3 different data sets. The first set, from the years 2019 to 2023, the first set includes all electric utilities that are covered by S&P Global. The second is the edited S&P data set that is effectively the vertically integrated electric utilities only. We've heard a lot of talk in the proceedings so far about the 2023 average of 9.8%. And then the last column is the data set with the way that the company itself had filtered these data. The only reason I bring this up is this is a useful tool to use as kind of a gut check. We can see, just looking at 2023, for example, we can see among these 3 different data sets, ROEs that have been authorized on average between 9.6% and 9.8%. And that's fairly close to the range. And in fact, the 9.8 is within the range that I ultimately recommended here.
Okay. And, Mr. Lawyer, I'm not sure if, you're the one who could answer this. I think Mr. Watkins, actually addressed this more. And, in the discussions with Mr. Pollock and Ms. Hager, relative to 1CP, 12CP, do you know, is ORS confident that, I guess, DEC's use of 12CP versus 1CP will not diffuse peaks and marginalize them and ultimately cause peaks to increase and thereby increase the need for generation?
You broke up a lot on me on that question, Commissioner Caston.
I'm sorry.
I do remember the conversation between Ms. Hager, or with Hager and Mr. Pollock. I do agree with Ms. Hager about the difference between the cost of service and actual rate design, and that the 12CP or the 1CP or whichever CP you choose is going to pin responsibility of costs on certain classes in that study. That's what I agree with. The other part I'd have to defer to possibly Michael Seaman Wynn behind me, who might be able to address the second part of that, about your peak questions. Does that make sense?
Yes, it
Okay.
does, and I'll maybe ask that next panel. I appreciate it both. Ms. Pardue, thank you so much. Mr. Lawyer, I appreciate it. No more questions.
Thank you, sir.
Commissioner Thomas?
Thank you, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
First off, I'd like to just start out by saying appreciate all of the work that you all and everybody else has put into this. And I have, I think, just 2 questions for you, Ms. Purdue. And one of them relates to page 36 of your direct testimony. And that is table number 5. And what I'm looking at, I'll give you a second to get there.
I'm there, sir. Thank you.
All right. So what I'm looking at is the authorized equity ratio for the electric operations, and specifically Duke Energy Indiana. It's 40.98% in your table. And the reason that I'm asking this question is twofold. One, I mean, that's obviously an outlier there. And secondly, I asked the company witnesses to provide me the information that's basically included here. And they told me that it was 54%. Can you help me with that?
Absolutely. So as I noted in the footnote on that table, Duke Energy Indiana does have other components in its capital structure than just long-term debt and equity. So that is what brings that down when those are included. I did include, if I can find my place, in footnote 29 of my direct testimony, if we exclude that 40.98%, the ratio for The average electric equity ratio comes up to 52.44% across that group. So that would be the difference.
All right, appreciate that. Basically, you're the lucky one that's the last of the rate of return witnesses, and I'm sure you've heard some questions and comments throughout this proceeding, and your name was mentioned and that kind of a thing. I just would like to throw it out there and make sure that you've had the opportunity to say whatever you want to say. It may or may not be, everybody may not have asked you the right questions at this point to give you that chance. And just like to know, do you have anything else that you would like to add at this point?
I appreciate that very much, Commissioner. I was present to hear. I don't necessarily remember all the comments, but I don't think I have anything additional at this time.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's all I have.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Powers?
Thank you, Chair Belser. Mr. Lawyer, so you don't feel left out. In his settlement agreement testimony, you say that that the settlement agreement provides customer protections to terminate the grid improvement plan deferral. I think that's on page 4.
I'm sorry, on 4 of
In your
settlement agreement or
in your settlement testimony.
testimony? Okay. Now, it's only 5 pages, so I can probably find it pretty quick. Okay, where now?
Where it says that customer protections, the agreement provides customer protections to terminate the grid improvement plan deferral. You talk about terminating that deferral.
Yeah, the settlement agreement did result in the termination that effective August 1st of this year.
How can you elaborate on how that protects customers, or terminating the plan provides customer protection?
Well, I think the biggest protection I see is that if you look at a deferral, I kind of look at it as a parking lot. You're taking all this money and you're putting it in this parking lot. While it sits there for several years, maybe 5, I don't know, until they come in for a next rate case, that's a good bit of money that builds up. So we're trying to alleviate that. We don't think it was appropriate for deferral treatment to begin with. That's why we recommended that it was terminated. Mainly that's probably the biggest point. The dollars behind it. It's basically O&M expenses. Let's build that into rates where they can proceed with their O&M as well as get recovery for the.
So you have a deferral and the carrying cost.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, it seems to me there have been a lot of deferrals on different things. How do you feel about deferrals in general?
In general, I think if used appropriately, I think it's a good tool for the company to have. This commission has been very clear in the deferrals department. You approve the 2-prong test, the 8 considerations that follow that up. I think if we adhere to those properly going forward, we would use deferrals more appropriately than just as kind of a catch-all parking lot going forward.
Okay. I read somewhere that, or some idea that there's all this solar waiting to go on, and it's going to take some development as far as transmission, more so than building any other kind of plants. Does ORS take a position that still pushing solar or pushing renewable more than a new plant or new
Well,
gas?
no, first of all, ORS isn't pushing solar or non-solar. We review, vet, whatever proposals may come before us. And I know there's a lot of solar that's in the IRPs, for instance, especially for Duke here. They have recently had the 2022 RFP in front of you in CPRE. Now they have 2023 RFP. So solar's not slowing down. We're not against it. We're not necessarily for it. It depends what's most economical for the customer. and for the company to provide reliable, high-quality service. If that's it, that's it. If it's not, it's not.
And you said that, you felt like this was a real benefit to the customers by using the EDIT through the end of July 2025. What happens to the customer in August of 2025?
The impact from the EDIT, which is about $6.42, would terminate. And the typical 1,000 kilowatt hour customer's rate would then be $18.95 instead of the $12.53.
And what will that percentage be as far as an increase in year 3?
It would be the 13.6% would be the increase.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Carolyn Williams?
Thank you, Chair Belzer. Some of us sitting up here, especially when we were new to the commission, would find that once we were through with a case, we wish we could do it all over again because of what we learned in this process. And maybe all of you have similar kind of thoughts. But witness lawyer, as you were talking about the grid improvement plan and that deferral and O&M expenses, it made me think of this question. And you may not be the right person, and I appreciate your referring me to the right person, or perhaps even the company may choose to respond to this question. And that is, grid improvement plan, if it were, because it's deferred, is it included in the O&M expenses? There's been discussion about the fact that the company has held O&M expenses over this time that they've been out. And everybody in this room may understand that, but I didn't think about that until the exchange that just happened between you and Commissioner Powers.
For lack of a better term, I'm going to defer that question to Mr. Anthony Brezina, who will be on the next panel.
Great. Thank you very much.
Loaded with deferral information.
Good. No further questions.
Mr. Austin, any redirect?
Just briefly, Chair, thank you.
And maybe, like I say, I may be able to help with some of that as well.
Who is talking?
But
Who's talking?
anyway,
Who is talking? Who is that? I can't hear you. Mr. Robinson, you want to talk to your witness?
Chair, is that, I wanted to
think
confirm
it
whether or
was-
not,
They telling me it was Mr. Guyton.
okay,
It's
well,
not-
Mr. Guyton, if you're on, please go on mute. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. Mr. Austin?
Thank you, Chair Belzer. Mr. Robert, Mr. Lawyer, just one question for you, just to clarify for the record. In a little bit of a discussion with Mr. Hall, you were talking about a $41 million number, and I think you were referencing a JIGITS exhibit document. Were you referencing attachment A, page 14 of 18? I'll put it on the screen just to confirm.
Mine says 14 of 276, but it is the attachment A.
It may have been filed twice, but is
And
this?
I think it has been.
Has the various adjustments?
Yes,
That's the attachment to the settlement agreement
Right.
that you're looking at. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Yes, that is the same one.
That's the information you
Yes.
were referencing. I just wanted to clear that up for the record. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
Ms. Purdue, just a few questions for you. Did Mr. Rothschild use a different proxy group than you?
No, he used the same proxy group as I did and Mr. Quinn.
But he had the opportunity to use a different proxy group if he chose?
Yes,
Okay, and earlier there was some discussion. You're asking the commission to accept the settlement agreement in its entirety, correct?
that is correct.
I believe you testified before that possibly analysts or commissioners could reach different results on an ROE number, that it's not an exact science. Is that right?
Correct.
But here, that's an isolation or as a thought experiment. Here you're asking them to reach or to agree with the terms of the settlement agreement, correct?
Correct, I am asking, I'm here in support of the settlement. I believe that was in the discussion of the 973 and whether we could move
Do
down
you
potentially.
believe it would be proper to look at the ROE or the cap structure in isolation from the rest of the settlement agreement?
The settlement agreement is comprehensive, and the 9.94% and 51.21%, percent equity ratio are a part of it.
And you would agree that while those are two items of the settlement agreement, there are a substantial list of items or issues that have been resolved as a result of the settlement agreement?
Correct.
Okay. And though you did not ultimately rely on your CAPM model, did it help you in any way evaluate Mr. Coyne's analysis?
To the extent that we used different inputs and thus received or came to different results, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Austin. Panel, thank you for being here. Thank you for your testimony and your time, and you may stand down. All right, let's do some, we've got 3 more witnesses, and then we've got a lot of stipulation to get in, and I've got a hard stop at 2:45. I don't see us getting through 3 witnesses, although I hate to bother people about tomorrow, but is anybody gonna raise Cain if we recess until tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock?
No, ma'am.
Okay,
No, ma'am.
thank you. It's kind of hard to say no, right? Once I'm not chair, nobody will be laughing at my jokes anymore either. I know that's gonna happen, and that's fine. So, let's is 9 o'clock okay? Or y'all want to do 9:30? Commissioners, we got to go, and some of the DCA and some of the ORS have to go too. Why don't we say 9:30 in the morning, just to give us a little break? We've been pushing hard all week, and I really appreciate everybody working with us on that. The days we've been in the hearing. So we will recess until 9:30 tomorrow morning. And then hopefully you won't have to see me for a while. Y'all have a good evening, and those traveling, please have safe travels, and we will see you tomorrow morning at 9:30. Thank you. We are in recess.